my name is George, and in this video I'm going to talk about the waterfall model. These are the contents of this video. I'll talk about our responsibility as software professionals, then I will talk about the research I have done on the waterfall model. We may then conclude that for a big project, the waterfall model can turn out to be a big and bad approach. Just the facts which refers to how the waterfall actually works. Then I'll talk in more detail about the research that was made regarding this model. And finally, I will provide the key points. Let's get this guy out of the way and let's get it started. As software professionals, we should be interested in knowing at least the basics of our own history for just the same reasons that as citizens we are expected to know about our national history and about the world history, so that we will be able to make informed decisions and know who to trust, who to listen to, so that we are not deceived by lies. And true histories generally have an agenda. Where someone is trying to sell you something, as the saying goes. Uh, Quite a bit of the current debate on software engineering relies on opinions regarding the creation myth of the discipline, the so-called waterfall model of sequential software development, also known as the SDLC, software development lifecycle. Unfortunately, most of these opinions are widely inaccurate. After reading numerous papers, articles, and books about the waterfall model, I have stumbled across Laurent Bozowitz's The Leprechauns of Software Engineering book. In this book, Laurent Bozovitz wrote the entire story, and I was surprised to see that someone already did what I was doing at that time, basically doing the research of the waterfall model. Being so accurate, I have integrated his research into this presentation. I'll put the link into the description in case you want to buy and read it. Maybe you can find some other research that's interesting to you. As you can probably recall from the Red Riding Hood, where the big bad wolf tries to catch and eventually eat the Red Riding Hood, I also thought that this character can be associated with the waterfall, and that's because if a project is big, then the chances of failure are higher and higher due to the rework that must be done. And that's just a bad thing that can happen to the success of that project. And the wolf, in which in our case is the waterfall, uh, waits for the Red Riding Hood, which is the people who are working on the project, to get to the testing stage where the wolf reveals himself, jumps out of the bed, and eats everyone. In other words, that's the point where people will realize that rework must be done. The article "What Killed Waterfall Could Kill Agile" by Robert Martin provides what is now the nearly universal explanation of how conceptions of the SDLC became pervasive in the discourse of software engineering, and we will get to it in the upcoming slides. But if you go on Wikipedia and search that out, you can find further confirmation uh, of the seminal character of Royce's paper. For many, the standard story is the whole story. Over the ensuing decades, even though many variants on the waterfall lifecycle were proposed, that all have their uses in one context or another, the waterfall still remains one of the major foundations of software engineering. Is the model to learn as a basis for learning other variants, and as such is taught um, quite seriously at many universities. It is a constant fallback of enterprise software development efforts, a norm against which other models are judged. Uh, but in any case, the following are widely, in fact, almost universally agreed upon. Dr. Winston Royce invented the waterfall model in 1970. Uh, the nascent software engineering community welcomed to the break from artisanal practice of the past. Uh, the model was instantly enthusiastically adopted as a sequential, non-overlapping phases model. Having become an industry norm, the model was taken up by the United States Department of Defense. Variants of the model were developed later and used where appropriate. There are at least two modern endings to the mythical story, told by different people according to whether they agree with the tenets of the agile movement for the agilists. Um, Tragically, this was all a misunderstanding based on careless reading of Royce. Royce was actually advocating an iterative and incremental approach in this paper. Whereas for people who disagree with agilists, waterfall is a recent coinage and has been used only as straw man term. Formal life cycles are not actually as inflexible and risky as waterfall is made out to be. And finally, Royce's paper wasn't actually advocating a rigid sequential approach. The article by Robert Martin cited before is representative of the first group. For instance, he writes, Royce began the paper by setting up a strawman process to knock down. He described this naive process as grandiose. He depicted it with a simple diagram on an early page of his paper. Then the paper methodically tears this grandiose process apart. Apparently, the authors of Department of Defense did not actually read Royce's paper because they adopted the grandiose, naive process that Royce's paper has derided. To his great chagrin, Dr. Winston Royce became known as the father of the waterfall. Larman and Basili, in their brief history of iterative and incremental development, offer support to this interpretation with a quote by Walker Royce, which is the son of Winston Royce. He was always a proponent of iterative, incremental evolutionary development. The second group is well represented by the following excerpts from a 2003 web essay titled "There's No Such Thing as the Waterfall Approach, and There Never Was." I don't recall when I first saw that term, but I'm sure it was in a pejorative sense. I'm unaware of any article or paper that ever put forth the waterfall methodology as a positive or recommended approach to system development. In fact, waterfall is a strawman term coined and used by those trying to promote some new methodology by contrasting it with a silly alleged traditional approach that no competent methodology expert ever favored. Phase disciplines, when practiced with sensible judgment and flexibility, are a good thing with no offsetting downside. They are essential to the success of large projects. Bogus attacks on the non-existent waterfall approach can obscure a new methodology's failure to support long-established sensible practice. In fact, both modern interpretations are demonstrably wrong. Not only that, but all the elements of the standard myth turn out to be false, or at least substantially at odds with the historical record. First, what was Royce actually saying in the 1970 paper? Many who echo the Agilists quote a part of that paper where Royce says that the unmodified sequential approach is risky and invites failure. However, As we all know, with selective quotations, we can make anyone say anything we want. The full sentence was, I believe in this concept, but the implementation described above is risky and invites failure. In other words, Royce is cautioning against simplistic interpretations, but not condemning the basic idea. A few paragraphs further, Royce adds this, which for some reason is much more rarely quoted. I believe the illustrated approach to be fundamentally sound. The remainder of this discussion presents five additional features that must be added to this basic approach to eliminate most of the development risks. From a close reading of Royce's paper, the illustrated approach refers to Figure 3, that is the picture showing a cascading series of activities allowing for that iteration to occur between the succeeding phases. Therefore, the analysis phase may undergo rework on the basis of errors uncovered in the design phase, for instance, or the design may undergo rework as a result of errors in the coding phase. The risky and invites failure comment can be inferred from its placement in the text to refer to Figure 2, which showed the same cascade of activities but no feedback loops at all. So, by recognizing that there could be unforeseen design difficulties when a baseline is created at the end of each stage, Royce enhanced this model by providing a feedback loop so that each preceding stage could be revisited. This iteration is shown with orange arrows in figure A. This allowed for the stages to overlap in addition to the preceding stage to be revisited. After the iterative loops, Royce recommends five additional steps. The first three recommendations, to design the program before beginning analysis and coding, to document it completely, and to build a pilot model, are all aimed at uncovering and solving problems before entering the test phase. Regarding the five additional features, again, many people give in to the temptation to mention only one. That supports their reinterpretation of Roy's the recommendation to do it twice, for example, to flush out technical risk by building a prototype, and this is only 3 out of 5. Um, for completeness, the remaining 4 recommended features are add what we would now call an architecture phase at the start of the process, um, or on the side of too much documentation. Make sure to plan, control, and monitor the testing process, and have the customer formally involved to sign off on various deliverables. Royce suggested that a preliminary design stage could be inserted between the requirements and analysis stages. He felt that this would address the central role that the design phase plays in minimizing risks by being revisited several times, as the complex feedback loop of Figure B shows. One aspect of the waterfall model is its requirement for documentation. Royce suggested that um, at least 6 distinct types of documents to be produced. Requirements document during the software requirement stage, preliminary design specification during the preliminary design stage, interface design specification during the design stage, final design specification that is actively revised and updated for over each visit of the design stage. This is further updated during the coding and testing stages. The test plan during the program design stage. This is later updated with test results during the testing stage. And finally, operations manual or instructions during the operations stage. Finally, Royce's iterative recommendations stop short of allowing at any point that the first 2 requirement phases of the cycle can be included within an iterative loop. The do it twice recommendation is confined to the design and implementation stages. In planning for testing, Royce suggests the following for consideration. Many parts of the test process are best handled by test specialists who did not necessarily contribute to the original design. If it is argued that only the designer can perform a thorough test because only he understands the area he built, this is a sure sign of a failure to document properly. Good, with good documentation, it is feasible to use specialists in software product assurance who will, in my judgment, do a better job of testing than the designer. Most errors are of an obvious nature that can be easily spotted by visual inspection. Every bit of analysis and every bit of code should be subjected to a simple visual scan by a second party who did not do the original analysis or code, but who would spot things like dropped minus signs, missing factors up to jumps to wrong addresses, and so forth, which are in the nature of proofreading the analysis and code. Do not use the computer to detect this kind of thing. It is too expensive. Test every logic path in the computer program at least once with some kind of numerical check. If I were a customer, I would not accept delivery until this procedure was completed and certified. This step will uncover the majority of coding errors. While this test procedure sounds simple, for a large, complex computer program, it is relatively difficult to plow throughout every logic path with controlled values of input. In fact, there are those who will argue that it is very nearly impossible. In spite of this, I would persist in my recommendation that every logic path be uh, subjected to at least one authentic check. After the simple errors, which are in the majority and which obscure the big mistakes, are removed, then it is time to turn over the software to the test area for checkout purposes. At the proper time during the course of development and in the hands of the proper person, the computer itself is the best device for checkout. Key management decisions are when is the time and who is the person to do final checkout. And finally, step 5, I quote. Figure 10 summarizes the 5 steps that I feel necessary to transform a risky development process into one that will provide the desired product. I would emphasize that each item costs some additional sum of money. If the if the relatively simpler process without the 5 complexities described here would work successfully, then of course the additional money is not well spent. In my experience, however, the simpler method has never worked on large software development efforts, and the costs to recover far exceeded those required to finance the 5 step process listed. So here's the summary of Royce's recommendation. And if you have a large project without these additional steps, this waterfall approach might never work. Anyone with an interest in so-called development processes should read the Royce paper carefully at least a couple of times in their careers. But the really interesting part comes when we remember that in any discipline with an academic tradition, papers don't exist in isolation. Fortunately, with the help of today's web series, bibliographic research is within everyone's reach. For instance, we can use Google Scholar to understand the real history of Royce's paper within the larger context of the software engineering discipline. Scholar gives us, in particular, a list of the citations of Royce's paper, which can be narrowed by date. Did Royce's 1970 paper invent or formally define for the first time the concept of the software development lifecycle or the notion of a succession of stages? The answer is no. The first papers cited that mention and draw a diagram of a sequential or stage-wise model of software development go back at least to 1950s. The first known presentation describing use of such phases in software engineering. It was at the Symposium on Advanced Programming Methods for Digital Computers. This presentation was about the development of software for Sage. I have talked about Sage in a previous presentation, so I'll put the link into the comments section. The identification of Royce's paper as the origin of the waterfall is largely arbitrary. Royce's paper was, however, the origin of the most common picture of the waterfall, with its instantly recognizable downward cascade of boxes and the loops showing iterations between phases, which some later authors omit. Was Royce's paper an instant hit? The answer is no. Taking a step back, let's look at a graphical representation of how often Royce's paper is cited in the software engineering literature. We can see that the 1970 paper in fact remained almost totally unknown until 1987. What the chart doesn't show is a peculiar property of these early citations. Just about every single one of them is by an author at TRW, a US defense contractor who employed several of the authors involved in the early years of the software engineering discipline, including Barry Boehm, known for an exceptional number of contributions to the field. It turns out that Bohm, who cannot be accused of having read Royce carelessly, used Royce's well-known diagram, which is figure 3, the one with feedback loop between successive phases that Royce characterized as fundamentally sound, in a 1976 paper modestly titled Software Engineering. In that paper, Bohm didn't give a credit to Royce for the picture, though he cites an unrelated paper of Royce's. Rather, that diagram was used with only the briefest of explanation to provide a structure for the rest of the paper, which examined phase by phase the recent advances in software engineering. Several early authors, in fact, refer to the diagram as Bohm's waterfall rather than Royce's waterfall. Here's a quote from a paper by two of Bohm's colleagues at TRW the same year. The evolution of approaches for the development of software systems has generally paralleled the evolution of ideas for the implementation of code. Over the last 10 years, more structure and discipline have been adopted, and practitioners have concluded that a top-down approach is superior to the bottom-up approach of the past. The military standard recognized this newer approach. The same top-down approach to a series of requirement statements is explained without specialized military jargon in an excellent paper by Royce, but he introduced the concept of the waterfall of development activities. Rather than support the idea that Royce's paper drew instant support and influenced military practice in software development, this quote suggests quite the opposite. The defense contractor TRW, who also had contacts within the U.S. Defense Department's responsible at the time for defining these standards, seems to have seized on Royce's paper as a good introduction and justification of existing practice. Using Google Scholar to reconstruct the history of Royce's paper, we can finally understand how it ended up being known as the origin of Waterfall. Notice that there is a sudden surge of publications citing Royce's paper in 1987. This is due to the paper having been republished in that year's International Software Engineering Conference at the uh, initiative of none other than Barry Boehm uh, in his software process management lessons learned from history. Royce's paper was republished alongside two others that Boehm deemed of particular interest from a historical standpoint. One of the others was the 1970s paper, which already defined a stage-wise model. Another sudden surge of publications can be seen around 2001. The cause is harder to identify because by then the myth is well established and the overall number of papers published each year that cite Royce is quite significant. But it is a safe bet that this renewed interest in is due to the growing popularity of Agile at that time. There was a very good reason to call attention to the waterfall model at that time. Bohm had just introduced the iterative spiral model of software development, which would become one of his most significant publications. Bohm wrote in 1987. Uh, Royce's paper already incorporates prototyping as an essential step compatible with the waterfall model. What is particularly striking in this quote is the compatible with. Boehm seems to forget that if he takes Royce as the originator of the waterfall, then this prototyping step isn't compatible with the waterfall. It is part of the waterfall. So in effect, this quotation is kind of a smoking gun. It is the historical moment where the waterfall is being separated into two halves, one stupid waterfall and one enlightened reading. This later enlightened reading isn't given the name waterfall, perhaps because to do so would diminish the import of Bohm's own spiral contribution. In this sense, the interpretation of the waterfall as a straw man is not entirely false, but it isn't accurate either to say that waterfall was always a straw man. For the first two decades, nearly it was discussed generally quite favorably, if only within a relatively small circle of authors. The story that the written record seems to tell is that uh, the Royce invented waterfall was a convenient myth. Uh, Convenient because people could satisfy the requirement of garnishing their papers with a citation, and because it provided a relatively Prussian strawman of older, more primitive processes than the more modern iterative processes could be contrasted with, and a myth whose career began 17 years after the original publication, breaking a long spell of obscurity, but also starting down the road to infamy. I find the story, the true story of the waterfall, much more interesting and enlightening than its caricatures. Ideas have histories. They don't come into the world complete and of one piece. An idea's history is often more interesting and complex than we suspect. And knowing and researching the history of your field is an important asset in critical thinking. It will protect you from common misconceptions. And indexes like Google Scholar provide great opportunities to reconstruct the history of particular ideas and concepts, providing everyone with basic tools of bibliometrics, a set of methods to quantitatively analyze scientific and technological literature as defined by Wikipedia. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new from this video, and I will see you next time.